In the Bavarian countryside outside a village called Aschheim, archaeologists opened a row of 6th century graves expecting nothing unusual. Modest burials, a few clay pots, the quiet, ordinary residue of ordinary deaths. Then, in 2013, a team led by researcher Michaela Harbeck drilled into the teeth of several of those skeletons and extracted something the original excavators had no way of finding. DNA from a bacterium that had been sitting dormant in tooth pulp for nearly 1,500 years, Yersinia pestis, plague. Not the Black Death. That came 800 years later. This was older, and almost nobody alive today has heard of it. The bones date to the 540s. That decade sits at the center of a claim made by a Harvard historian, Michael McCormick, in a 2018 interview with Science magazine. Not the worst decade in Europe. The worst single year to be alive in the entire span of recorded human history. He didn't mean 1918 when influenza killed tens of millions of people in a matter of months. He didn't mean 1349, when the Black Death emptied English villages so completely that some simply stopped appearing in tax records. He meant a year most people have never encountered outside a footnote, 536 AD, and the plague victims buried at Aschheim aren't where this story starts. They're where it ends up. Something else happened first, years earlier, and it had nothing to do with disease. It started with the sky. A Byzantine official named Procopius, writing in the 540s, described the sun during this period as giving off light without brightness, as though the world had slipped into a permanent, dim eclipse. Not for an afternoon. By his account, for close to 18 months. Chinese court records from the same years mention snow falling in what should have been summer. Irish monastic chronicles record a failure of bread severe enough that someone thought to write it down for people who hadn't been born yet. None of these observers knew each other existed. Different languages, different religions, different corners of the world, all of them looking up at the same broken sky. For nearly 1,500 years, historians treated this as an unusually consistent folk memory. Interesting, maybe symbolic, but unverifiable. That changed with a drill bit, not a manuscript. Beginning in the early 2000s, a glaciologist named Michael Sigel led a team pulling ice cores out of Greenland and Antarctica. Ice like this builds in layers, year over year, and each layer traps a small record of whatever fell from the sky at the time. In the layer corresponding to 536, Sigel's team found a sharp spike in volcanic sulfate, chemical proof of a massive eruption, likely somewhere in Iceland, though the specific volcano still hasn't been identified. That eruption would have thrown sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere. Global winds spread it across most of the northern hemisphere within weeks. The particles didn't block the sun outright. They scattered it, dimmed it, exactly the effect Procopius was trying to describe with no scientific vocabulary available to him at all. The immediate result wasn't darkness. It was cold. Dendrochronologist Ulf Bointgen examined tree rings from across Europe and found some of the narrowest growth bands in the last 2,000 years clustered precisely in this window. Trees don't lie about a bad summer. Thin rings mean short seasons, stunted growth, stress written directly into the wood. From that evidence, researchers estimate average temperatures across parts of Europe dropped somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees Celsius. On paper, that number looks almost boring. A single afternoon can shift by more than that. But hold a drop like that steady across several consecutive growing seasons, and boring becomes existential. Grain needs a certain number of warm days to ripen. Shorten that window enough, and a smaller harvest isn't the outcome. No harvest is the outcome. Climate historians call this stretch the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which is a clinical name for something that, on the ground, meant real people watching real fields fail. And the eruption of 536 wasn't a single blow. Sigel's ice core data shows two more major eruptions following, one around 540, another around 547, each one landing before the atmosphere had fully recovered from the last. A society can usually absorb one bad harvest. What Europe and the Mediterranean faced instead was something closer to a decade with almost no dependable summer at all. Poor harvests created famine. Famine weakened entire populations. Weakened populations crowded into port cities and trade routes still recovering from centuries of imperial expansion became exactly the conditions a pathogen needs to spread efficiently. Which brings the story back to Pelusium, an Egyptian port city, in 541. A disease outbreak began there and moved along Roman trade networks with a speed that alarmed the people watching it happen in real time. Historians call it the Plague of Justinian, named for the Byzantine emperor who reportedly caught it himself and survived. For centuries, the identity of the disease was educated guesswork, pieced together from symptoms described in surviving texts. Then came the same kind of evidence that solved the mystery of the dark sky, ancient DNA. In 2013, Dave Wagner's team confirmed Yersinia pestis from Plague-era remains, the same bacterium later found in the teeth at Aschheim, the same species behind the Black Death 8 centuries afterward. Procopius, our clearest eyewitness once again, described bodies accumulating in Constantinople faster than the city's cemeteries could handle. He claimed officials eventually stacked corpses inside the towers of the city's own fortifications. It's a vivid detail, and historians treat it carefully because Procopius had his own reasons to dramatize imperial failure. He wasn't a neutral observer. He was writing in part to make a political point about the emperor he served. That caution matters for the death toll too, and this is a place where honest historians genuinely disagree. Older scholarship, built heavily on Procopius, claimed the plague killed a quarter to half of the Mediterranean population. A more recent reassessment by historian Lee Mordecai argues those numbers were likely inflated, and that mortality probably varied enormously by region, hitting some areas hard and leaving others comparatively untouched. Neither side disputes that the plague was real or that it was severe. What's contested is scale, not existence. Even Mordecai's more conservative reading still describes damage deep enough to shrink cities, empty farmland, and gut tax revenue across the Byzantine Empire for a generation. Volcanic sulfate cooled the atmosphere. Cooling shortened the growing season. Shortened seasons produced famine. Famine emptied out the immune reserves of entire populations. Weakened populations gave a bacterium the opening it needed. Each stage set up the next almost mechanically. No single villain required, just one broken system quietly loading the next. The political cost reached further than the graves. Justinian had spent enormous resources trying to reclaim the western half of the old Roman Empire, campaigns that depended entirely on steady tax revenue from a productive countryside. Historian Peter Saris argues that the famine and plague hit at precisely the moment those campaigns needed stability most, stalling what might otherwise have become a genuine reunification of the Mediterranean world. Some historians go further still, arguing that a century of recurring plague waves left both the Byzantine and Persian empires too exhausted to resist the rapid Arab conquests that reshaped the region roughly 100 years later. That argument is more speculative, and not every historian accepts the full chain. The underlying picture of two depleted empires meeting a newly unified force, though, is hard to dismiss outright. None of this stayed within the Mediterranean. Chinese dynastic records from these same decades describe drought and crop failure. Tree ring and ice core data from Japan and Korea show matching climate disruption. One eruption, or a tight cluster of them, appears to have altered growing conditions across nearly the entire hemisphere at once. Centuries before anyone had a word for a connected world, people scattered thousands of miles apart were already sharing the same atmosphere and paying for it together without any way of knowing it. Which brings the story back to Procopius, standing in Constantinople, staring at a strange dim sun, reaching for the only explanation available to a 6th century mind: divine anger, omens, forces beyond ordinary understanding. He had no concept of a volcano erupting somewhere in the North Atlantic he would never see. He had no concept of aerosols drifting through the stratosphere, or bacterial DNA hiding in tooth enamel. He wrote down what he witnessed and left the real explanation buried, quite literally, in ice that nobody would examine for another 14 centuries. That gap between witnessing a disaster and actually understanding it is really the center of this whole story. The people who lived through 536 experienced something documented from Ireland to China and had no framework at all for connecting a volcano, a failed harvest, and a plague riding in behind it. We have that framework now. Sulfur trapped in polar ice. DNA recovered from teeth in a Bavarian churchyard. Frost patterns preserved in tree rings a continent away from the eruption that caused them. Piece by piece, across 3 separate scientific disciplines that didn't even exist as fields until the last century, historians finally reconstructed a catastrophe that unfolded in plain sight and still went unexplained for 1,500 years. What we don't have is any guarantee that the next version of this kind of convergence would look any more obvious to us than it did to them. Climate systems, pathogens, and trade networks still run on the same physical rules they did in the 6th century. The volcano would still erupt without warning. The bacterium would still travel where the trade routes take it. The only real difference this time is that someone eventually would be able to explain why.